I'm very, very pleased to be joined today by Ajamu Baraka, the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. Baraka serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition. He was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and is the recipient of the Serena Sherm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have the pleasure of saying that I voted for you in 2016, famously to be vice president of the United States of America, a vote for which I was accused of being both sexist and racist. And so I want to open by asking what you think of how your role in the 2016 continues to be characterized and maligned by the media at large, particularly in the context of how identity was weaponized in 2016 and continues to be leveraged?
Well, that's a very good and interesting question. It's to take it beyond the personal and related to the Green Party. Of course, in 2020, the Green Party was a target by primarily the Democrats in order to not repeat what happened in 2016. In 2016, the party ended up being on 46 state ballots, including some of those very critical states that went over to Trump. So in order to make sure that there was not a possible repeat of that, Democrat Party related entities and state officials basically were able to keep the party off of the ballots. So the party or the campaign, the Howard Hawkins campaign, was only on about 32, 33 state ballots. So it's quite clear that, when we talk about voter suppression, we need to also include in that conversation party suppression. And when we talk about voter suppression with the Republicans, we need to bring in the fact that it was the Democrats who were primarily responsible for party suppression. And of course, both parties conspired to make sure that there remains the two-party monopoly. So, the notion of our campaign being a spoiler in 2016 remains. There's still people who are very angry at us because we attempted to provide a democratic alternative to the two parties. To this day, we see that people are not as supportive of the notion of expanding the democratic processes as we think they should be, because of the sort of idea that if you have a alternative outside the Democratic Party, then you just open up the door for continued rule and dominance of the Republicans.
So it's obvious to me why the Democratic Party is so hostile to third party efforts, right? They benefit a great deal from being able to argue that they should secure votes by virtue of being the lesser of two evils without really having to offer anything close to what pluralities of Americans want in terms of a policy agenda. But I'm curious what your conversations have been like with voters who might be broadly sympathetic with a Green Party, but who have difficulty getting past the idea that in a first past the post system, a third party is going to inure to the benefit of the worst of all the evils. How is, when you put your kind of organizer hat on, as opposed to, a political hat or a philosophical hat, how do you have those conversations?
Well, it's very delicate. I mean, of course, because you find the voters are very pragmatic. So while they might be sympathetic to your positions, they are very much conscious of the balance of forces, if you will. And so the response has to be to an appeal to an imagination of a political process that transcends the present. An imagination that we can actually have a broader democratic process. So you have to appeal to those sentiments, those desires, those values. And that's very difficult, but it is the only way that one can approach this question of democracy. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what kind of democracy will we have in this country? Will it continue to be basically a process democracy that only provides a mask for the rule of the elite? Or are we prepared to struggle for a democracy in its original definition? And so this appealed to people that we can, in fact, be more than what we are today, that we can restructure society, that we can have a more responsive and fuller democracy is part of the task of organizers. And that's why for many of us, we don't make a separation between the role we play in the bourgeois political process and as organizers. When we ran in 2016, we were quite clear that we saw this as a process for building popular power. We made the argument that if you're going to participate in the electoral process, it should be a strategic participation and should be seen as part of the broader struggle to build alternative popular power. If you're not doing it, if you're not approaching the electoral arena in that way, you're only replicating the worst of the candidate-centered political processes. And when you do that, you're playing a losing hand because you can't really defeat them in that kind of process. So that's how we approach it in terms of people understanding that this is part of a longer term process of building real popular power. It's idealistic in some ways, but you have to imagine something before you actually are able to achieve it.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think the Bernie 2016 candidacy, and obviously carrying through to 2020, helped people to expand their political imagination.
Exactly.
We're having very different conversations right now than we did before then. I think if you had said healthcare is a human right in 2010, I don't even know what that would have meant, or if you would have gotten laughed out of a room, or if it just would have been a platitude meant to apply to a public option, right? But certainly these days we've expanded the Overton window. But I've noticed that even among the left, discussion of third party politics or any kind of real adversarial politics outside of the two-party duopoly is met with a level of scorn that is really out of step with the other commitments, ideological commitments that the left are willing to make. What do you make of that? And what do you think will happen? Is it possible to work within the system and continue to elect progressive members of Congress like the Squad members and make progress that way? Or do you see a third party insurgency as a real necessity to achieving anything close to the kinds of progressive platform agenda items that Bernie and, of course, the Green Party for a long time has been advocating for?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not really even sort of an either or proposition. And I know you're not constructing it in that way. I think it's both and. I think that, and that's why I never really dismissed the possibility of a insurgency within the Democrat Party. I don't believe that insurgency has ever really played itself out fully. It got close in 2020, but I think that some of the supporters of Sanders didn't understand the terms of struggle. They thought that the neoliberals that controlled their party was just going to open up the door and allow this insurgency to take over, and that wasn't going to happen. So in the battle within that party to shift some power and to maybe make some inroads I think is a legitimate one. But I also think that has to be coupled with efforts outside the duopoly and building an effective radical party based on the interests and aspirations of the working class, I think is vitally important. In fact, it's fundamental.
Well, can you talk a little bit about why you feel it's important and why you think a third party plays a different role than progressives working within the Democratic Party?
I think that we bring in the class element, the class and race element. We bring in the fact that the ultimate objective has to be the radical transformation of this society. We cannot harbor any illusions that that's only going to take place through voting and the electoral process. So the third party, if you will, is not going to be just a party that engages in the electoral process, a third party and a fourth party and a fifth party and social movements are going to be part of the process of transforming the society as a whole. So expanding the range of participation, both in bourgeois politics and beyond, is vitally important. And having that participation grounded in an anti-capitalist and pro-socialist viewpoint that one will articulate and needs to be articulated with boldness and without any kind of apology is absolutely necessary. Plus, it corresponds to the ideals and the reexamination that many people, in particular young people, are involved in when it comes to how the society is organized, how the economy is structured, and the kinds of values that they want to actually embrace. So it's absolutely necessary that we open up this process and that we build new kinds of formations.
What I always am trying to figure out is, how to do the thing. Yes. So, the critique that both the kind of Bernie inside approach got and the Green Party outside approach got is that it was not able to put together this multiracial coalition. The coalition didn't manifest. It did on some generational basis. But the problem with younger voters is that historically they tend not to turn out in as large numbers. And you have a real uphill battle when it comes to figuring out how to get older voters to buy in to an agenda that wants to largely disrupt a system that they were the last generation to have benefited from, right? A generation that doesn't necessarily see the cracks and flaws in the system the way that, let's say, mine or the younger generations do. And, I wonder, as you think in particular about Black voters, what you think is the likelihood or the potential trajectory of decoupling that voting bloc, which is, for better or worse, a voting bloc in a way that is unique among racial demographics in this country. Decoupling it from the Democratic Party in a way that could make it more politically potent. What do you see as the biggest obstacles to doing that?
Well, I think part of it is the sort of generational element that you just referred to. And the other part, of course, is a kind of pragmatism that, again, voters have. They may even have some fairly sort of progressive or even radical ideals. But if it doesn't seem that those ideas can be implemented in reality, then you're not going to be able to pull them in a different direction. So you have to have a different strategic approach. I think that the approach has to be less on the national level and more so on the local and state level. And has to be one that is understood would be a protracted one in which you systematically build power from the bottom up. If you're going to participate in the electoral process, then you concentrate your efforts in those places where you can win a city council seat or a state rep seat, or maybe even a mayor seat like what we see happening in Buffalo. And you couple that work with the continued expansion work in terms of organizing in your community. So you are in fact building a movement with the electoral process being a part of that process. Okay, and that's the end all, but it's part of the process. It's going to take time, but that's the only way I think that it can be built from the bottom up. But it can, in fact, in my opinion, be constructed.
So part of my skepticism there is only that you see with India Walton in Buffalo that already the incumbent that she beat is entering the race to run against her in the general election. You saw Kshama Sawant in her city council seat in Washington State being subject to this recall election. I was just out there over the weekend as part of her campaign, solidarity campaign's efforts. Where we do have successes, you see an enormous effort from the corporate elite. In the case of Kshama Sawant, Amazon leveraging all of its resources in the state to push back against the victories that she's won there, including a $15 minimum wage. And it makes me a little skeptical of a kind of one step forward, two step backward approach. And I also, I come to think of the ways in which the right, funded very differently with very different incentives that align in a way that is convenient to them and not convenient to the left, nonetheless have been able to advance their causes, not just relying on kind of a grassroots kind of populist approach, but by engaging in a faux populism that's largely driven by the media. And I wonder whether sometimes when you see relatively organic uprisings like we saw last summer, if there aren't opportunities in those moments that could be leveraged in more effective ways than they are. This is something that we've talked about on the podcast, and I just wanted to get your insight into what you think went on or is going on with Black Lives Matter as a movement, and whether you see any political potential there.
But let me first address the first part of your commentary, your question, and sort of push back a little bit and suggest that when you look at the evolution of politics within the Republican Party, and I had a sort of a front row seat, and not just seat, but participated in the pushback against the pushback. That is, they built something quite systematically from the bottom up, really beginning in the 1970s and really intensified in the 1980s. When I was working for the Voter Education Project, for example, in the South, the last of the institutions that came out of the Mississippi Summer of 1964, we were attempting to organize and to train people to engage the process, to build power locally in their communities, in their counties. And we saw the counter to that. And that is the systematic effort on the part of Republicans to build a machine, even in the South at that time. And so we saw this systematic effort taking place. And when Ronald Reagan was able to win the executive, that provided them even more momentum. So by the 1990s, they were a real machine. And that's why you had the contract with America that we call the Contract on America by 1994. They had built structures across the country, primarily focusing in on local politics, city councils, county commissions, Board of Education, et cetera, and congressional seats, of course. So that kind of systematic, long-term support for that kind of approach, you don't see with liberals. Liberals they'll give you some resources and they want results in a year. Okay. You look at the think tanks that provided the intellectual support for those efforts, and look at the amount of resources they were able to galvanize. Now you compare that to the liberal think tanks, and it is scandalous. And here you have liberals who have even more resources, in a sense. So, it is approach, it is vision, and is understanding, the protracted nature of how you build power. So yes, so today they can in fact utilize their spaces in the media. They built a whole media infrastructure, ecosystem, if you will, to take advantage of these moments that come up where they can further advance their forces, and the liberals have not done the same. So, that I think is the difference. And I think that's also the possibilities. People have to understand that the conditions are such today that young people recognize they see no hope. They don't see how these contradictions of the economy can be resolved, and they can't. And that's why they are looking anew at ideas like socialism. That is primarily why the state and their propagandists are so adamant in trying to undermine the prestige of that idea by their campaigns against these efforts on the part of various states in their imperfections to try to build something called socialism. So, that is the task today. And the Black Lives Matter movement, it came out of this environment, came out of these contradictions. It came out of this desire on the part of people to address the ongoing state violence that we were being exposed to and subjected to. But I'm going to tell you, Briahna, at some point over the last, up until, say, 2019 or so, and really into 2020 specifically, Black Lives Matter lost its sort of mojo, if you will, its reason to be, because the conditions had gone well beyond just a desire for something called racial justice or criminal justice reform. I mean, Black Lives Matter always had sort of a smoke and mirrors element to it from the very beginning.
How do you mean?
But it wasn't really until that there are a lot of people who came into the movement who cut their teeth on local work under the banner of Black Lives Matter. But Black Lives Matter ended up with, it came out of a hashtag. And from there, you try to then build a structure. And there was different degrees of success at, in fact, doing that. It never really, in my opinion, congealed into an effective national entity, if you will. It was mainly just, the various chapters around the country who engage in reform work around criminal justice and some racial justice stuff as they
And what would it have taken to congeal nationally in the way that, in your view, would have made it more effective, or could still make it more effective?
They could have followed up with their 2015 national convention or conference with additional gatherings, bringing together national forces across the country, national Black radical forces across the country. We could have been involved in developing a real radical program, one that went beyond just criminal justice reform. So you had to have leadership with a perspective and a politics that went beyond the kind of reformism that we saw reflected in the Black Lives Matter slogan.
And so how do you think, what I'm really curious about is what the mechanism for leverage would be for this organization, right? Because the fact of it being national in and of itself doesn't necessarily change its ability to be effective. It might have a more cohesive message and might get better or different kind of more specific kind of media coverage. But do you have thoughts about how it could better leverage its efficacy in terms of ability to force the Democratic Party in this instance, most likely, to recognize its specific demands? Well,
the thing about an effective radical opposition is one that, in fact, is not going to be limited just with the strategic focus on the Democrat Party. It would be a movement that can engage the process, of course, but that what makes it effective is the linkages, the connection between the local organizing and the national profiles, the coordination and the concentration of efforts based on strategic planning. It is based on its ability to galvanize support from the population. And that way, if you are attempting to try to impact the local legislation, for example, and you have an organized force, you can in fact do that. The same thing if you attempt to and feel that you want to engage in some type of pressure campaign on the national level. The key to all of this, Briahna, is organization, as simple and mundane as that might be. And that's the task that we have to engage in. And that's what did not really happen that effectively on the national level. Plus, we got to keep in mind, it's so fundamentally important for a radical Black formation to exist that also saw its vision beyond the borders of the U.S. because of the strategic location of where we are at the center of empire. So one of the drawbacks to some of the Black Lives Matter activity also was what I call the U.S. centrism. This focus just on the politics of the U.S. That one could be a radical in the U.S. but not say a mumbling word about U.S. imperialism. As important as it is for Africans in this country to, in fact, talk about that. So none of that really took place.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about that because, Black Lives Matter recently made a statement in support of Cuba, the current regime, in a way that got it some backlash from a lot of liberals who have taken to adding BLM to their profile, but don't necessarily espouse the kind of radical politics that would be sympathetic to, communism. And the Black Agenda Report, the Black Alliance for Peace, I believe you pinned that statement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter on this issue. Can you talk a little bit about your position and some of the pushback that you've received as a result?
Well, we felt it was important to align with that statement. We thought this was a very important statement, and we thought it reflected a shift that's taking place, perhaps with the leadership of that formation. And we saw the response from liberals and Republicans and conservatives across the board attacking Black Lives Matter for taking a position that 30 years ago would have been a position taken by the Congressional Black Caucus. And so we felt it was important that we stand with them on this issue. We believe that that is the route to go, that it is unprincipled for us to stand aside and allow for the U.S. to engage in aggressive and criminal activity in Cuba, in Haiti, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, on the African continent, without a counter-aggressive pushback from African people in this country and other progressives. So we hope and encourage that this is the beginning of that. So we felt it was important to stand with them on this. And we've been saying that's the essence of the work that we do in the Black Alliance for Peace. We make that connection between our opposition to militarism domestically and militarism abroad in the form of AFRICOM, for example. So bringing those connections together is part of the traditional Black radical tradition, the internationalist perspective of that. And so we encourage them and will, if they continue to make those kind of comments, we will stand with them going forward.
I was wondering a little bit about your commitment to kind of internationalism and reflecting on your biography. And I hadn't realized that you must have been a very young man. You fought in Vietnam. Can you talk a little bit about how your personal experiences influenced your politics and how you came to be who you are today?
Yes. Well, I didn't actually fight in Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam era vet. I got caught up in the last draft of the period in early 1972. And in fact, that military experience was the factor that really moved me to fully embrace radical politics. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was under the influence of all the activity and the work of Chairman Fred Hampton. And when he made the call for us to proclaim ourselves as revolutionaries, some people stepped up, some people weren't ready for it. I was one of the ones that was too much of a knucklehead at that point to, in fact, embrace being a real revolutionary. But I was politicized. But going into the military in 1972, that was the transformative element for me. And I became an organizer in the military. I'd always been understood issues of race, of course, as an African in the U.S., and understood also, too, the issues of class. So the politics of the Black Panther Party and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, et cetera, all of this came together for me in the early 1970s. I got involved in the Pan-African, revolutionary Pan-African movement and been moving ever since. Look, we really believe, Briahna, in the 1970s, we had absolute certainty that we can win, that we can, in fact, transform these conditions and transform ourselves. Okay. And that's something that I really feel bad about, that many young people just have never had a chance to experience.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think happened?
What happened was basically the defeat of our movement in the 1970s, the counterinsurgency and counter-revolutionary politics in the 1970s. And one of the main objectives of that counterinsurgency was to make sure that another generation that was produced in the 1960s would not be repeated. And that's why we had, and I don't want to go into all the tactical things they did, but again, it was to, in fact, it was to Americanize, if you will, the Black person, the African in the U.S., to do what Nixon started in terms of advocating that Blacks needed to have a stake in the system, to accelerate the affirmative action process, bringing in and expanding the Black middle class, the Black petty bourgeoisie, you know? And I think in my opinion, the culmination of that process of Americanizing the African, of making us a U.S. patriot, culminated with the election of Barack Hussein Obama. And so that's what happened. Counter-revolution. That's what happened.
Yeah. You know, my mother, who was born in 1960, talks a lot about how she felt that tradition, having been brought up in a radical tradition with a father in the Nation of Islam and a kind of hippie mother, and how when she went to Howard in the early 80s, that she really felt that influence of Reaganism, and how kind of appalled she was by the lure of consumerism on her schoolmates, and how it felt like the competition to get a certain kind of car and a certain kind of job and to go work on Wall Street was just enormous, and that it was such a sharp turn from the revolutionary potential of her childhood. And I'm curious, with your perspective, if you're optimistic at all about the moment we're in right now, or if it feels very different than the 60s or 70s felt.
It definitely feels different, and I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think for example, they call it the Gen Z generation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this generation, more so than any generation for quite some time, is one that I think we have the possibility of rebuilding an effective oppositional movement here in this country. I feel good about that. I think that because of, it's going to be difficult though, because the system does not have the ability it had back in the 70s to 80s to co-opt like it did. It doesn't have that kind of space.
Well, what's different? Can you feel free to be specific about? You mentioned earlier that you didn't want to get into too many of the technical specificities about the de-escalation of revolutionary potential in the 70s or 80s, but I think that kind of specificity and historical perspective is really helpful for folks to be clear-eyed about what exactly stands in the path and how to undo that damage.
Yeah, well, in the 80s, in the 70s, I really believe that there was a number of cultural and political changes that were taking place. There was escalation and or intensification, if you will, in the process of desegregation, or some people might call integration. But I think that the difference today, Briahna, is that the economy was such where some degree of incorporation was possible, even in the 1980s, as the economy was at that point restructuring. We had the development and expansion of the whole neoliberal counter-revolutionary process. So you still have people who had hope in the system. They had hope that they can get that job. And the fact some of them were in fact doing that. In the 1970s, because of the affirmative action stuff, they were taking people out of college who hadn't finished yet and giving them these big time jobs, because the whole objective was to expand the middle class. But as the economy restructured, as the neoliberal project that was first imposed in the colonial world and the global South, you begin to feel the effects in the metropolitan countries in the U.S. and Europe. The scope of economic opportunities began to be constrained. And so there aren't that many opportunities. People are indebted. People are starting to see that they don't have an ability to realize the so-called American dream. And because of that, they're now thinking more critically about this system. They are looking at alternative ways of living, alternative ways perhaps of organizing society. And I think for that's what gives me the hope, because I see people really grappling with these new realities and coming to conclusions that are quite radical.
I want to go back to this question of third parties and also this issue of organizing that has come up, because so often, when you ask a question about how to affect political change and the answer is organizing, and it seems so abstract. And in particular, the critique of a lot of third-party efforts, whether it's the Green Party or the Movement for a People's Party, is that they have done insufficient organizing. And the fact of it not having ballot access in all 50 states, or not being able to secure more than 3% of the vote or what have you, is cited as evidence that it doesn't have its organizing bona fides, and therefore it's trying to cheat the system or take shortcuts, or somehow isn't deserving of more attention from the left. And I wonder how you respond to that kind of criticism.
Well, I mean, some of that is valid. And I think what's happening is that people are really just sort of relearning the lessons of how you build organization, how you build movements. But I think people are recognizing that there are no shortcuts. You're not going to build an organization by just attracting some celebrities with high name recognition. If you can do that, that's fine. But if you're not prepared to engage in the nuts and bolts, systematic, persistent organizing, then you're not going to cut it. And that organizing has to be informed by a real set of skills that allow you to have some kind of cultural competency, if you will, to be able to talk to people, to be able to construct plans that make sense strategically. So again, yeah, it is the whole appeal or call for organizations does sound abstract, but I challenge people to explain to us another alternative.
Well, it's not just that it sounds abstract, it's that it is abstract, right? I mean, it's not that, this isn't like I recently watched the Fred Hampton movie on a plane, and it's not as though there's like the headquarters downtown that has a brick and mortar and that people belong to an institution or a group that is in a community providing free lunches to kids and political training. I mean, even belonging to a group like, DSA, as I do, I know it's also a pandemic and that is a barrier, but, online meetings periodically, signing up to gather signatures or do tabling periodically, I don't think it engenders quite the level of personal commitment, pride, and investment that some of these Black liberation groups did in the 1960s. And I wonder if you think that is necessary to get people to move from the abstraction of organizing, which often seems to be a bullying tool to excuse why we don't have X, Y, and Z, to organizing as something that people really feel like is something that will serve them and their personal interests enough to want to participate.
Look, when I talk about organizing, that's exactly what I'm referring to. I'm not interested in the kind of online activity that sometimes we get confined to. I'm talking about the old nuts and bolts, old school organizing, person to person, block to block, community by community. And in fact, Briahna, there are people who are in fact doing that. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening in various parts of the country. They don't get a lot of attention, but they are not always that well developed. But there's a lot of that kind of work. And I'm gonna tell you, a lot of it took off too during the pandemic with the mutual aid activity. For the first time, people started looking at that community differently. And they started really applying in a very creative way, ways in which they can, in fact, address some of the material needs of their communities. And what that resulted in was a development of a whole new set of skills among these organizers. So, yes, I'm with you. That basically, if we only talk about organizing with, signing some petitions and these endless webinars, that ain't where it's at. We've got to begin to move toward really building, having a physical presence in those communities, rethinking what communities mean, being accessible to the people, expanding our ranks. That is the only way in which people build power. And see, I'm sitting here in the Global South where people, in fact, are effective in building power, that old school way. And the issue we have is that we have almost 2 generations in which that kind of organizing activity didn't take place. And therefore, we're now trying to catch up in terms of helping people to build the kinds of organizing skills that one needs in order to be able to effectively build alternative popular power.
Well, I know our time is up, but if there are any organizations in particular that you'd like to draw our listeners' attention to, or writings that you've done recently that you'd like to flag, please take this time to let people know where to find you, your work, and any other mutual aid projects that they should be knowledgeable about.
Well, I would have to use this opportunity to, in fact, push, what we're trying to do in the Black Alliance for Peace, because we are, in fact, trying to facilitate the process of building organizations from the bottom up. We are an internationalist, anti-imperialist formation, but we understand that we've got to build that process in our communities. We've got to raise consciousness in a systematic way. So we have been building for the last 4 years. We said go to the blackallianceforpeace.com to help us to build opposition, anti-capitalist opposition in this country. and to help us to keep the U.S. accountable and to put a break on its criminal activity across this planet. So Black Alliance for Peace is one. The Black is Back Coalition is another that's out there trying to build. You have Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, that's serving as a model for how you build co-ops and dual power. So look around and you'll find that there's some groups that are doing something that's really quite exciting.
Well, thank you, Ajamu Baraka, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. For those who aren't already subscribers, you can get an additional episode every week by going to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. And for $5 a month, you can get access to our full back catalog of episodes and some really great stuff. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. And again, find us over at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Keep the faith.